Hollis, welcome. This is Josh Dippold of Innerskilled, and today I've got John Nieters with me. John, what's going on today?
It's a beautiful day here in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's just absolutely gorgeous. And I'm here to treat patients, which is what I really love. So I'm very pleased. And I'm here, Catherine Black, who's an associate of mine, is also here. And she's the technical whiz in case I blow it here on camera. So
It was a little bit of getting connected, but here we are, and it's interesting. The last few interviews I've had too, there's some challenges here and there, but here we are. It seems to be working okay. So with my standard question, who's John? What kind of work does he do?
Well, my name's John Nieters. My day-to-day work is being a doctor of acupuncture and oriental medicine. Started out with a master's degree in acupuncture and went on and did two doctoral programs. And started a third, which I didn't finish because it was in China and it was going to take too many trips over there. So I get to treat people every day, and I do a combination of traditional Chinese medicine and functional medicine. And about 25 years ago, I had my eyes just blown wide open. I did a course with a fellow named Jake Fratkin, long time acupuncturist, and he was doing a course, this is 1999, about leaky gut. Well, at that time, nobody knew what leaky gut was. If you said leaky gut around a medical professional, they branded you a lunatic and told their patients not to ever talk to you again, right? And now we see stuff about leaky gut every day. I get research papers. So he was just way ahead of his time. But when I saw how we could do these very sophisticated and also some simple Western medical tests to determine so many things that with Chinese medicine, we get beautiful generalization, right? So you have qi stagnation, you have blood stagnation, you have some type of heat or some type of deficiency. But by doing the testing, we can get incredibly specific. You know, your microbiome, your overgrown bacterial overgrowth, fungal overgrowth of these specific species. And to treat those, these are the best herbs to do that. And when I saw that, I can't tell you, it flipped my life completely around because I had no idea. And I was talking about the microbiome again 25 years ago, and giving people wacky supplements like probiotics, right? And the doctors were telling their patients, really, stay away from this man. He's having you ingest bacteria, right? And literally. And then in 1997, inexpensive tests for vitamin D came out. And there were like 3,000 studies within the first couple years, all showing that vitamin D was so critical and that we were, most of us, deficient. So I started giving what I consider moderate doses of vitamin D. But again, the doctors were saying, oh my God, he's going to kill you. And so I've kind of been riding that wave through as new discoveries come on. And I was told by a very, very good researcher who was a researcher at a medical hospital. So they had the medical training on one side and they had the research across the hall, basically. And he said they have timed it through dozens and dozens of innovations and inventions and discoveries. And on average, it takes 17 years to get from the research side to where they start teaching it in the medical hospital. You figure there's, now the specialists, of course, are a little ahead of that, but it takes a long time for these basic understandings to get across the hall. And so in functional medicine, we're using very different values. Catherine and I researched several hundred studies, maybe thousands, but hundreds and hundreds, looking at the healthiest levels for the different simple lab tests. So if you go in and have a chemistry panel and your liver enzymes are in a particular range, well, there are sharp inflection points where you start to see mortality shoot up pretty dramatically. Usually you have a U-shaped curve and there's a sweet spot at the bottom. And if you go higher or lower, then the mortality risk goes up. Well, you'll see, for example, primary liver enzyme test, ALT, it'll say usually 60 to 0 to 60 is normal, or 0 to 40 is normal. Well, the inflection point is actually at 21. That's where you start to see a sharp rise in mortality. But the only way you can have a 0 is if you're dead. You have no liver activity at all, or your liver is just completely gone, right? And so the ranges are very inaccurate for health. They're okay. If you're out of those ranges, you need to get a medical intervention or go to the hospital, but it's certainly those are not the ranges that are going to keep you healthy. So I just have the best of both worlds, Josh. I mean, it's when I do an initial intake on a patient, which takes about 2 hours because we go through massive amounts of history, Chinese diagnostics, tongue and pulse, and then Western diagnostics. And so it's very, very, very thorough. And patients are all blown away because they've never experienced that before. Plus, the other thing is what you are so good at, which is being present, right? And they're not used to their practitioners actually being present with them and giving them their full attention. And my one thing that I never run out of is Kleenex. It sits right here on my desk because half of my patients will start crying during the intake because they have felt unheard, right? And so just listening to them, you can see, and you know this, just listening, they start to heal. So I love my work. Yeah. So that's kind of me in a nutshell at this point. My history is quite varied, but I won't go into all of that. So this is what I love. And one of the reasons I came to acupuncture actually kind of late. I started studying Tai Chi and Qigong in the early 1970s. And my first teacher was a master herbalist. So I started studying herbs with him. But I didn't go back to school to get my acupuncture license until the mid 1990s. So by that time, I was in my late 40s. So I came to this pretty late. But one of the reasons I did it is it gave me a clear demand of creating presence. Years ago, I owned a real estate company. That didn't require the same type of presence. I was answering phones and writing contracts and things, and I knew I never wanted to do that type of thing again. And so here, I will do a quick scanning meditation every time before I walk into a patient's room because I don't want to take something from person A to person B. And so I will just do like a Vipassana meditation basically, but just body scanning to see if there's anything stuck in my energy field. And that's one of the reasons I did this because it created the demand that I do that 15 to 20 times a day at least. Right. So, yeah, so that's kind of me.
Well, very cool. When you're talking about this complementary, I think it's a no-brainer to me to use as many relevant tools that are possible for well-being, and you illustrated that so well there. I'm curious what was coming up for me is there any way to know, or what's kind of your sense that the traditional Chinese medicine approach already knows what the tests are confirming? Do you know what I mean? Without even the test for confirmation, or usually my guess is it's pretty spot on most of the times, even without the test, and the tests are maybe just confirmation. And while the test can actually even make it go more deep and more precise, perhaps, but
Yes.
it's pretty much on the money most of the time anyway, right? Or how would you
Well,
describe that? Yeah.
I'm going to tell a quick story. A fella named Bob Flaws, is still the top writer of Chinese medical books in English and also the top translator. He's translated more information and books from Chinese into English. So very, very sharp guy. And I was doing a class with him once. It was actually in my doctoral program, and it was a psychiatry module. And so we had a doctor from Stanford come in for 2 days and talk about that. And then Bob Floss came in. Bob's an interesting character. His staff called him Boundaryless Bob. And so he really bugged some people, right? They considered him very arrogant. I just considered him a teacher, right? And he was a very bright guy. So we're sitting there and someone asked the question, Bob, why do we study these Western ideas of psychiatry when with Chinese medicine we can really see these things also? He said, well, I'll tell you about my story. He said, um, I knew that I had some issues, right, in life, but it wasn't until I got my diagnosis of Asperger's that it really changed my life. I got to understand myself even more deeply because it was so specific. And you could hear the entire room go, "Oh my God, of course," right? Because he had all the traits, but it's one of the things that allowed him to concentrate, and he could not give up his focus once he started on something, right? And so and he pointed out that, for example, we can feel a pulse, look at someone's tongue, and tell that they have blood stasis in the lower jowl, so the lower part of the body. But that much of the diagnosis will be the same if they have hemorrhoids or ovarian cancer, right? And so now you can take other signs and symptoms and put them together, and figure out if it's hemorrhoids. And if it's not, then you're going to look at ovarian cancer and probably send them out to get a scan, right? Send them back to their gynecologist. And so the specificity is there. Now, what is beautiful about Chinese medicine is, well, I had a woman come in a few years ago, and she'd been to the Mayo Clinic, and she literally brought about 2 inches of lab reports and studies. And so I read through them, went through them, and this is the Mayo Clinic, right? The clinic in the United States. And I said, "What's their diagnosis?" And they said, they don't know. It's an unknown autoimmune disease. And I said, "Okay, well, let's take you in and treat you." And she said, "Well, what are you treating me for?" She said, "They don't know what's wrong with you. I'm going to treat you from a traditional Chinese medical perspective, and let's just get you well." And so within 2 months, she had none of her symptoms. She went on a huge round the world vacation, ended up in Greece. And so that's the beauty of taking these two systems, right? And applying them where appropriate. I don't care what works as long as something works. Is it qigong? Is it meditation? Is it diet? And often I'll treat people for a while, and they'll say, well, and they'll get well, and it's like ulcerative colitis. "Well, do you think it was the acupuncture or the diet or the herbs?" And I'll say yes, right? I'm not running a controlled study here. I just want you to get well. And so by combining those systems, all of those, right, including the meditation, I don't know how it is where you are, but I find in the United States, we have, the monkey mind is so severe that it's hard to get people to shut down at all. And so we cheat. We'll give them tools. There's several different programs that you probably aware of where you can wear a device on your head and it will track your brainwave patterns. And there are 3 different ones. And so we'll have people try one of them. And so that it's biofeedback essentially. And so then when they get into that meditative state, when they get into a low alpha or a theta, they love it, obviously. And then it's training them to be able to get there without the device. So again, we'll use whatever tools we think will work.
I love that approach to neurofeedback too. I've got a psychologist friend who has done that with patients. And yeah, see, I was in the false mode of thinking that people are just going to become dependent on that. They won't know how to meditate without that. But I like that. It's a reference point for beginners to get them, especially some skeptics. Some people, they just have to have scientific backing for everything, and that's
Absolutely.
okay. For those people, we just have to give them that. And then so they can get better or join the club, I guess, so nothing wrong with catering to those folks either. Yeah, so that's really great. I guess I want to shift here. You did say autoimmune, so I'd like to get into like the big picture, I guess. I mean, what are like the health epidemics going on right now? I hear, well, of course we've had cancer for a really long time, but I think before it really got more prevalent, there it was kind of a rarer thing. But now we have things like autoimmune disease, which is a kind of, I guess, like a catch-all thing for lots and lots of different stuff. I guess those two, and then anything else that's huge, and then I guess just dive into what you want to say about them, because the big picture of what a lot of people are facing right now and going through.
Well, fortunately, we have a couple days to talk here, Josh, because my mind is just now racing off in half a dozen different directions, right? Let me talk about the cancers first. I got an email yesterday, I think, maybe it was 2 days ago, from a young woman with colorectal cancer and wondering if we could help her while she's going through chemotherapy. And acupuncture is very good for reducing nausea, anxiety, and also if people do acupuncture while they're doing the chemotherapy, they almost never get any tingling, numbness, neuropathy in their hands and feet. Actually, a woman that I went to my doctoral program with did a study at University of California at Davis, where they were working with medical doctors and treating patients during chemotherapy, and the results were amazing. And so I said, yeah, but I then told her, it's interesting. This is my third case of colorectal cancer this month. Now, I've gone years and years without having someone come in and need help getting through chemotherapy for colorectal cancer. So that's a biggie. And we're seeing these supercharged cancers a lot. There are 400 doctors in Canada got together and started calling them turbo cancers, where they had people that had, seemingly beaten cancer 20 years ago, were in recovery, remission, and then other patients who had never been diagnosed, and suddenly their cancers exploded. And a cancer that might take years to take someone was they were dying within a month or two. And so this all, came about during the COVID epidemic. And so the spike proteins seem to have really done a number. We were flooded with women primarily. And this is whether it was COVID or the vaccine. We saw both because they both have spike proteins. And so we saw a huge number of women with menstrual irregularities. And there was I can't pronounce his name, but a gentleman from Germany who did research at the beginning of the release of the vaccines. And he said, yeah, these will damage women's uterus, right? It'll affect placenta growth, et cetera. And we saw a lot of that. The other thing I saw a lot of was stroke. We are treating more stroke patients right now than I've ever treated before. And in my doctoral program, not by anything that I did, not by my being a great student or anything, but I was able to study with the two top stroke doctors in all of China, literally. Now, you got to think about that. All of China. And one of them does scalp acupuncture, and that's the most recent thing that's been added to the Chinese medical textbooks that we use in English. The other fellow was voted the top acupuncturist in all of China over a 40 or 50-year period, and he ran a huge stroke hospital. And I heard this number probably 4 or 5 times before I actually was able to grok it, to actually get my head around it. At this hospital in Tianjin, they saw 10,000 stroke and neurology patients a day. A day. They built a special hospital with a special rail stop because in China, they'll take one hospital in a region and make it the liver disease hospital, another one the cardiology. And so he ran the stroke hospital. There's a movie that was made of him called 9,000 Needles, and it was done by there was a fellow in the United States who had a stroke. He was getting conventional care here. He just didn't feel that it was adequate, so he went to China to be treated by this gentleman and had a full recovery. And so I have tremendous amount of stroke training, but I would go years without ever seeing a stroke patient. And now suddenly I'm just flooded with stroke patients. And that's a study done in Europe showing that they still found spike proteins 16 months after infection in those stroke patients. So it doesn't go away, right? It's, I mean, in some people it does, but in some people it doesn't. And so we're still seeing the after effects of the pandemic, with the turbo cancers, the autoimmunity, et cetera.
Well, um, I guess this is a kind of controversial topic that I have no qualms about diving into investigating this further. I don't know how much you've looked into it. My investigation is really cursory and layman's on this. But before we do, there's also would these fall under the autoimmune things? I mean, isn't this a huge thing too? What all falls under that umbrella? And you seeing are a lot of that, and then you know people talk about like the spectrum, the autism spectrum you mentioned a little bit before.
Right.
Can anything be done with acupuncture and what you're doing with what's going on with that too? Before we get into the
Absolutely.
spike protein.
20 to 25 years ago, I treated a fair number of autistic children. Um, I mean, it wasn't my specialty, but I was treating quite a few because at that time, I wasn't aware of anybody or very many people locally that I felt were doing a good job with autism. So I felt that I really had to, step in. And some of the most ridiculously rudimentary things were really helpful with those kids, getting them off of junk food, gluten-free, casein-free diets for a lot of them was just creating so much inflammation and irritation. I remember I had this one family brought in their little boy and his sister, who was a sweetheart, but brought in the little boy, and he literally started taking my office apart, taking the books, throw them on the floor. Finally, his dad actually had to restrain him. And so I just recommended an herbal supplement and dietary changes. And about 3 weeks later, they came back in, and the little boy walked in. He said, "Hello, Dr. John." And I just lost it. I started crying. It was just the most amazing thing. And so, really simple things can make a world of difference. Um, there's a doctor from Canada in the 1950s named Abram Hoffer, and he was treating people with vitamin therapies. For 50% of his schizophrenic patients had pretty massive recoveries and became useful members of society. At least they may have still had a few issues, but it was remarkable, and everybody was starting to pay a lot of attention. There wasn't a lot of autism actually in the 50s, but he was starting to treat that. And then the SSRI drugs came out, right, and that pushed all of his stuff off to the side, and everybody started using antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs, etc. But there's a Dr. Walsh who has written a book called Nutrient Power, and in it he goes through his work, reading Hoffer's work, and then starting to work with autistic children, and then kids with ADHD, and then working. The last, I think, he was working in the book, he was working with young men in the penal system who had been incarcerated. And he gave a lot of case studies. Like he would have some young man, 17, 18 years old, who'd been in trouble most of his life, and he'd go to the family. Now, I don't know where he got funding because he did a lot of testing. But he would go to the family and he'd test mom, tested fine, dad tested fine, brother who was an attorney tested fine, sister who was a doctor tested fine. But the kid that was in trouble had all sorts of nutrient imbalances, often zinc problems, porphyrin problems, a variety of things. And when he treated them, they became pretty much normal. Now, once they'd been in that system, they couldn't always be completely rehabilitated from an emotional standpoint and from a habitual standpoint, but their nutrient problems changed. And the ADHD kids, same thing. And it was really largely a neurotransmitter problem that was being created by excesses and deficiencies in diet and supplements and vitamins and minerals. I mean, Josh, we're talking about the simplest stuff ever, right? My
Yeah.
son, actually, um, I came, sweetest kid in the world. He graduated from college last year, but he was sweet he didn't have terrible twos. He was just always a delightful kid. And so one day I came home from work and I went and I was tired. I laid on the couch and he walked up. And this was just when he was starting to talk. He said, "I have to hit you." I said, "Oh, honey, you don't have to hit me." He said, "No, I have to hit you." And he started hitting me. And so I went in the other room and I asked his mom, I said, "So what's he been eating?" She said, "Well, I gave him a bunch of grape and apple juice." And I said, "Okay, don't give him any more until I get home tomorrow." So I get home, he's fine. She gives him a big glass of grape and apple juice because they put apple in almost everything because it's cheap. And within 20 minutes, he started hitting me again. And so that's typically a symptom of a salicylate problem. And grape and apple juice are very high in salicylates. And so once we kept him off of those, he never had another event. Right? Now, he could eat an apple, but he couldn't have the pure juice without having just huge emotional meltdowns. And so that was one of the things also with the autistic kids. And I kind of make a distinction. They talk about being on the spectrum. And I think there are the classic autistic kids that, through all history, people would have diagnosed as autistic. And then there are the kids that are on the spectrum. The classics, I think there's often brain damage and it's very difficult to treat those. But the other kids, who are probably 90% that are on the spectrum, they're highly treatable. I treated a lot of them, and mostly with nutritional changes. Yeah.
I wonder about, I'm a big organic food proponent, and I know it can kind of get political sometimes with some people, but I just wonder about some of the GMO foods and the lack of nutrients in the soil and how that might equate to the lack of nutriments and vitamins and minerals in mass produced food like that. I mean, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah. I have this when I don't teach nutrition anymore, but I did for many years. And I would invariably get asked by one person in the class, "Well, how could this stuff be a problem?" Right? Why, for 10,000 years, people have lived on wheat. It was the staff of life. And why would it suddenly be a problem? I said, because the wheat you're eating now has very little relationship to the wheat that they were, I guess Alexandria, they had like 500 breweries because that's how you could keep the B vitamins from the wheat from rotting over the winter. So you make beer out of it. Great idea. Love that. And so I said, because you're not eating the same food. The wheat that we eat has been so hybridized, right? The old einkorn wheat that's still used in a lot of Europe, you can't get here, right? And that had 14 chromosomes for gluten and gliadins. And we now eat this dwarf winter wheat that the guy won a Nobel Prize for because pretty much you can just grow it on a sidewalk. It does all it needs is some nitrogen. It doesn't need any other nutrients. So there are no nutrients in it. And it has twice as many, as 28 chromosomes for gluten and gliadin. And it has some that humans have never ingested before. And so every single human being, without exception, that eats this new wheat will have a leaky gut. It's because it's not an accident. There's, one of the things that has saved us as human beings wandering around the planet is we'd be hungry and we'd try to eat some new plant. Well, first you taste it, lick it to see if it's bitter, and bitter's often, if it's too bitter, that's not good. And then you'd ingest a little bit to see, if you got sick, and then it would, at some time become part of the food stream. Well, one of the things that occurs is when a poisonous substance gets into the small intestine, it stimulates something called a toll-like 4 receptor. And what that does, if it's considered a poison, that receptor throws open the junctions between the cells lining the intestines. And the purpose for that is to pull more water in, more fluid in, to wash the poison out. Well, of course, when those junctions are open, any inflammation from the gut is going to leak into the bloodstream. And there's one fellow, really, really bright guy, who talks about this, and he says every single time someone has a leaky gut episode, they also have leaky brain because it penetrates the brain, blood-brain barrier in exactly the same way. Now, I don't know if that's true, but this guy's very bright. But I do know that every time anybody eats the wheat that we have, they get a leaky gut. Now, sometimes it's only a matter of minutes, but for some people that are already compromised, it's pretty much permanent.
Wow, I knew there was something to it when I came to Europe over here and how the bread was just so, so much better and real. I mean, yeah, I just like that was the last thing I wanted to eat in America, really, is this pasty white bread-like substance. And it was just,
Right.
yeah,
Bread-like substance. I like
yeah,
that.
it's such a far cry from
Well,
real bread in Europe. Yeah.
my brother had been a big red wine drinker. He had a wine refrigerator about the size of my wall. And suddenly he couldn't drink it anymore. Every time he would drink it, he'd get a migraine. He felt horrible, and he couldn't touch wheat. I mean, he would have all sorts of problems. His eyelids would flake off, all kinds of stuff. So he and his wife went to Italy, and pretty much all they did was drink wine, eat pasta and bread, and they were perfectly fine.
I hear these stories all the time too. Yeah, in Europe they can because of these things. Yeah, that's it's different than in America, which I don't want to go down too much of a rabbit hole, but it's wild. What's allowed in the States. I mean, even I hear there's like thousands of chemicals that are allowed in the States in food, but in Europe there's not as many that are allowed in there. And they've even spray, even though they don't have to spray Roundup on wheat. Something they do it to dry it out quicker, I think, so they can
Exactly.
get more money, you
Exactly.
know. And I tell people there's nothing wrong with money. I mean, that's we have to pay our bills. But when it comes to our food and health, I mean, do we really want to promote people getting profit and making money by poisoning people? I mean, I just kind of say it like it is, or how I see it anyway.
Well, yeah, the whole glyphosate Roundup stuff, and the obfuscation that goes on. I mean, you can watch, like here in the U.S. Senate testimony where they'll ask someone from agribusiness, "Have you tested this for safety?" And they'll say no, right? And they'll then someone else will bring in half a dozen studies showing that it's deadly, but there's just too much money behind. Unfortunately, um, so many of our people in Congress, senators, congressmen, are taking so much money that they can't get elected basically unless they take the money from big agra and big pharma. So it's going to be hard to ever change that. But I don't know the exact numbers anymore, but at least 10 times more additives are allowed in the US than are allowed in Europe. It's a huge number.
Yes, and then the it's I think I glyphosate is bad enough, but I also heard that the proprietary things in some of these, is even worse. That some people had to like reverse engineer. I can't even remember but we don't know what we don't know either. With the proprietary stuff and some of these things they spray with.
Yeah, and then you've got the quality of the food. Well, you mentioned the soil. There was a report in the 30s, I think 37, before Congress, where they said that 70% of the land in the United States had no usable nutrients. Well, if there's no magnesium in the soil, it's not going to get in the plant, right? And so when you look at these tables, a lot, like in a nutrition book, a lot of those were done on tests from the 30s and 40s. But if you walk into a supermarket, you can find oranges and test them that have no vitamin C, right? And that's why people are doing it, right? But they grow them to be pretty, right? To be plump because they're being sold by the pound. The average chicken an eating chicken, a fryer, in 1957 in the United States weighed about 2 pounds. That same stock of chicken now weighs about 8 pounds. And I will tell you, that is not healthy weight that went into that chicken.
That's very unnatural, it sounds like. All right, so we'll get back to the spike protein now. how much have you researched this and what's going on, either with the vaccines? I've heard so much. What I've told people during that whole thing going on, I say at the end of the day, as long as we have a choice in our healthcare, then there's really not an issue. As long as people are allowed to decide what they can do with their health regimen, who they can go see, what they can do, what they can put in their bodies or not, as long as there's an individual choice. There's the, yeah. So I think that's the biggest thing. And luckily, we still had that as far as I know. Well, not everybody did though. It seemed like a lot of people were forced in positions, seemingly to not have that choice. It was a choice either to, give up your job or your
Right.
lifestyle or whatever, or just go along with it. But I guess yeah, you can address it on that level, but I guess more of the science and the treatment side of it, because I know this spike protein, like you said, it was both in the shots and in the actual thing itself. And like, what is your understanding of the spike proteins? What would you tell like a layman of how that works, and where do you think this whole thing came from, or if that's even helpful to
Now you're getting
mention?
into
Or
it.
yeah,
Well,
exactly, because
I,
I've heard so many different things too.
I tend to swim in the shallow end of the pool, but I listen to people that swim in the deep end of the pool, right? And, Luc Montagnier, who was the genius of virology, right? Um, Within a few weeks after COVID came out, said that it was impossible for this to be a naturally occurring strain. He said there is actually pieces of DNA in there that could not possibly be there naturally. There was actually an HIV strand in there. And so he said, now, again, I don't know, I can't do that research, but he was basically a hero. He's the guy that discovered HIV, right? Or, there's an argument, but he was at least one of the two people. And so then Francis Boyle, who was the attorney who wrote the pact to eliminate weapons of mass destruction, and he went around the world and got countries to sign that. Well, Francis Boyle came out not long after Montagnier, and he said the same thing, right? Basically, from a slightly different point of view, because he wasn't actually a virologist, but he took all this information. He said, yeah, somebody made this stuff. And then, you can follow the trail, actually. And it's pretty well delineated. In fact, the woman, Dr. Shi, SHI, won awards. And you can track it. I don't know if you can still do, but I went on right after COVID came out, and you could see her winning awards for her work developing these viruses. So,
There's
not the
patents.
final
It's a
one.
lot of it's patented too, right? The
Oh,
patents involved
patented
in it.
before
Yeah.
COVID.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and so there's so many smoking guns out there that and I understand that people don't want to look into that. They don't want to believe it. You want to believe mommy and daddy are taking care of you. That who would do this kind of thing. But to me, there's so much evidence out there that I from a scientific the guy, I don't remember his name, but he's considered the statistician of statisticians, right? And so they took all these data to him, and they said, tell us what you think the odds are that this was either a wild virus or that it was made in a lab. And he said, look, I was very biased. I assumed that this was a wild virus. I mean, why would someone make this otherwise? He came away with 98 point something percent likelihood, because he's a statistician, right? That this was made in a lab. So, these are the top brightest people on the planet in the fields that they're in. And so, far be it from me to think I know, a fraction of what they know.
These aren't conspiracy kooks, so to speak,
They have
right?
nothing
These
to
are
gain by
mainstream.
this. Yeah.
Exactly. Which gain of function, right? That we've heard
Yes.
that, but
What a
you know
term,
what?
right?
The it's just we didn't really hear. I mean, this put biowarfare on the map. You know, most people it hadn't come much on their radar. It was a really kind of a dark and shadowy thing, I think, before this. And yeah, I mean, I guess there's been some investigators looking into where it could have all possibly, originated and how and all this stuff. But I don't think we need to go into that so much because you're on the functional side of treating people, so maybe we'll just keep it there. And so, did you were you treating people for this during the lockdowns and onward? And what do you see with what some people are calling like long COVID and
Yeah.
yeah, what kind of protocols were you
The
using
answer
around
is
this?
yes and no, right? One of the scariest things to me was, and from what you said earlier, I think you'd agree, was a law was passed in California that you could only toe the company line. And whatever the prevailing opinion coming out of the CDC was, you must follow that. You could not say anything other than that, or you'd lose your license, right? And so we were totally gagged. And so when patients would ask me, I would say, I can't tell you. I'll lose my license if I tell you what I think, which kind of is a way of saying I don't believe the company line, but I'm not going to tell you otherwise, right? And that was, my hands were tied with that. Now, I would do things to treat the COVID, and that was okay because they clearly had, most of them had COVID. So there are a variety of protocols that have been developed. Dietrich Klinghardt has a great program. McCullough has a good program. I don't remember the name of the other group. It's a group of doctors that was very much at the forefront during COVID, and they all have come up with protocols to clear the spike proteins and to treat long COVID. Now, in treating the long COVID, getting the spike proteins to break down and get eliminated from the system is critical, but often there's already a significant amount of damage that's been done. And one of the places that shows up is myocarditis, which is, inflammation of the heart muscle. And the estimate is that only 1 in 20 cases of myocarditis actually gets diagnosed. So I check everybody for myocarditis. Now, we have a little bit of an advantage. We can run labs, but it doesn't always show up on a lab. But when I am interviewing someone, before I take their pulses, which is classical Chinese training, I'm looking at about a dozen different things on their hands and their fingernails, which can tell me if there's a likelihood, it's not absolute, but a likelihood of having heart inflammation. You can see little things called splinter hemorrhages if they're throwing some tiny blood clots. And you can see just a whole bunch of different signs and symptoms. And if I am suspicious, and then I'll listen to their heart, I'll send them to a cardiologist that will take them seriously, and some will and some won't. But I'll try to find an MD that will send them to a cardiologist. But we treat a lot of that. We treat a lot of long COVID. We treat a lot of spike protein issues. And again, each of those people have slightly different protocols, but there's a big overlap. I think all 3 of them are very big on proteolytic enzymes, nattokinase, serrapeptase, and lumbrokinase, which help break down blood clotting. And so that was one of the biggies is with COVID in China at one time. If people came into one of the larger hospitals, they do a test called a D-dimer. And a D-dimer tells you if there's blood clotting occurring in the body. It doesn't tell you where, but it tells you there's clotting. And they would run a D-dimer on people. And if they were in a particular low range, and they had COVID, they would just send them home with some herbs and medication. If they were in another range, a little higher range, they would hospitalize them. And if they were in a higher range, they figured they were going to die because they already had so much clotting. And so they would triage them based on that test for blood clotting. There was a group in South Africa that was getting 100% recovery, but what they were doing is they were doing a triple antithrombolytic with every patient that came in. So they'd give them some like heparin or something in the hospital, and then they would send them home with a blood thinner, Eliquis, Pradaxa, and also have them do aspirin. And all their patients survived. And so we did something very similar. I can't do the Western medications, but we have some very, very good blood moving herbs that we would use. Plus, we would use the proteolytic enzymes to keep them from having a heart attack or a stroke.
Wow. So yeah, I've heard this microclotting and things like this. Is this, I guess, an oversimplified version of how does a spike protein cause such clotting? Does it just blocks up the movement of the blood, or how does it work?
Essentially, yeah.
And then on such a small level, though,
The mechanism
Mhm.
is, the biochemistry is a little more complex than I feel comfortable knowing it. I don't feel comfortable teaching it or talking about it, right? It's a little beyond me. But essentially, yes, you get these microclots, and that's why I look at the fingernails, those splinter hemorrhages, because it looks like a splinter underneath the fingernail, but it's actually little clots that have gotten stuck in the tiny, tiny blood vessels underneath the nails. But that's one of the few places that you can see it. In men, you can actually see it on the scrotum, actually, because again, you've got the blood vessels right on the surface. And so you can see these little, it looks like bugs almost, little black spots on the scrotum, or you can see it looks like little little splinters in the fingers. So that's the first thing I look for. And if I see those, I know we've got to, get some blood stasis clearing herbs going on. The Chinese have been so hot on blood stasis. There are whole families of herbs to treat that. And there was a fellow in China, Yan Dexin, that's his name, who wrote the book Aging and Blood Stasis. And that kind of turned things even more upside down in China because they had considered the primary cause of aging to be the hormone issues. And in Chinese medicine, that's associated with the adrenal glands. And he said, well, yeah, of course that's important, but what kills people is the blood stasis. He said in diabetes, the high blood sugars don't directly kill people. What they do is they make the blood very, very sticky. And when it's sticky, so for example, if you ever see a photomicrograph of the eye, we think of the blood rushing through these little blood vessels, but actually those red blood cells are going blip, 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 right? And those vessels are so tiny that the red blood cells, the erythrocytes, actually have to fold up like a pizza pie to get through there, right? They can't get in there if they're flat. And so you could imagine if two of those get stuck together, and so, there's a test, hemoglobin A1C, which is measuring glycation or the stickiness, the amount of sugar on the red blood cells. And that's how they determine diabetes. Well, that sticky blood means it can't get through the eyes. That's why blindness is such a problem with diabetes. It can't get through the kidneys, which have tiny, tiny blood vessels. So they go into kidney failure. It can't get through the tiny vessels in the extremities, so people develop neuropathy. And it's the primary cause of stroke and blood clotting. And so the Chinese have been aware of this for a long, long time. And now the silver lining of the pandemic is there are a lot of things that have come to light that were kind of poo-pooed before. So this idea of microclotting and causing strokes and heart attacks. It's really, I did a cardiology class, 15-lesson cardiology class, and the first 4 lessons are just about clearing inflammation from the arteries, because that's the problem. It's so amazingly fascinating, Josh. So you've got these arteries that are very muscular. We think the heart pumps the blood, which it does, but the primary pumping action is from the arteries. They're pumping about 10 times, it varies on the person, but they're pumping the blood to keep moving it along. Very strong. That's why they take blood from the veins, which are very thin, and not the arteries. Well, lining that artery is a one-cell layer called the endothelium, and that's where all the damage occurs from, say, cholesterol issues or a virus or bacteria. But lining, and something they didn't know until relatively recently, is that endothelium is lined with what's called glycocalyx. And that glycocalyx, when you see it on an electron microscope, it's so beautiful. It looks like a kelp forest in the waves, right? It just, as the blood pumps, it goes this way and then it relaxes and comes back. And it's that glycocalyx which captures all the bad stuff. So, viruses, it's well known that the herpes family of viruses is implicated in strokes and heart attacks. Well, if you've got a really healthy glycocalyx, the virus can't get to the endothelium. Bacterial infections, even H. pylori from the stomach, can also migrate to the heart. Oral bacteria, which are the worst, the glycocalyx will capture it. It's like this big net out there grabbing the bad guys and throwing them out. And so, unfortunately, Western medicine doesn't really look at that glycocalyx. So that's my first thing that I fix in heart patients and stroke patients.
So that's a relatively new discovery then?
Yeah, yeah.
This opens up another thing I just heard of recently, and I don't know if you know what I'm talking about here, but and then I want to come back to the COVID, the gag order, which is really important, I think. I thought somebody was saying, maybe it has a term, but there are certain foods that resemble certain things in the body. And this is such a bizarre idea. I had, like you mentioned, a kelp forest. I thought there was some theory or something that said, well, if there's a challenge at some place in the body, then maybe eat certain foods that look
Oh
like
my God,
something in the body. Have you
you're
heard of anything
brilliant.
like this?
You're brilliant. Oh God, yeah. And so the week I started teaching that cardiology class, unknown, my rep from this company came in from my favorite company selling supplements, very bright guy, and he said, look, we've got this new product and it works on the glycocalyx. Now, you probably don't know what the glycocalyx is. I said, Kyle, I just taught a class in that this week, but now you're telling me how to heal it. And it is seaweed. I've got two companies that make similar products, and they each, of course, claim theirs is the best, and they each have different form. One has a green seaweed, one has a brown seaweed. I don't know which one's better. What I do is alternate them with my patients and with myself, but they have high levels of. They found out a few years ago in a study that people that were doing, glucosamine, chondroitin, hyaluronic acid for their knee problems have fewer heart attacks. And that's because those three things are found in the glycocalyx. And so the supplements will have that plus the seaweed, whichever one they use. And it's magic because I test what's called cardiac C-reactive protein. Doctors generally run just quantitative C-reactive protein looking for inflammation in the body. But cardiac, often called high sensitivity, will tell you if there's inflammation in the heart and the arteries. So I run that routinely. It's a very inexpensive test. And if I see that that's high, I'm going to put patients on a regimen to clear the inflammation from the heart and the arteries. And anything under 3.0, just to pick a number, is considered okay. Under 1 is ideal. I had a patient come in at 156. It's like I was afraid to let him leave the office, right? We put him on a regimen. In his case, it took a while because we found out that part of the problem is he had a recurring hidden viral infection. And I found that out accidentally because he got sick and I gave him antivirals and his HSCRP dropped. It's like, okay, let's treat the virus as well as treating your heart and arteries. And we got him down to normal in a few months. So, but that's one of the first. There was a study came out not too long ago, and it was done on women. I suspect the results would be the same on men. And if you check low density lipoprotein, which all doctors do, lipoprotein A, which is the genetic form of high cholesterol that cannot be treated with statin drugs. But if you check that and it's high, and you check high sensitivity C-reactive protein, you can predict heart attacks 30 years in advance. 30 years in advance. So then, of course, I had to dive in and do some deep research in, what supplements and will help lower lipoprotein A, since there's no drug. And it turns out it's the usual suspects, right? The stuff, resveratrol, turmeric, extra virgin olive oil, stuff like that, and a couple Chinese knotweed, things like that. But it's fixable. So
Well, that's fascinating. You would think that that everybody would want to test like that almost, because since it's such a common thing. I mean,
yeah.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
especially when you see a family history of heart problems,
Well, yeah, even more so,
right?
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you said that there was a gag order in California, and I can't help but think, well, shouldn't there be like a class action lawsuit? But then I'm just like, I'm not interested in suing at least for something like that. But what had happened was under the auspices of, I guess, emergency, right? At least we were looking into this in Missouri in a group that I was a part of, or just a very small part. It's basically they declared an emergency, and when an emergency is declared, well, then the normal processes is set on hold, and then a new thing it then comes into
Right.
place, right? And
Yeah.
so all the other due process and all the way of normally operating gets put on pause, and then that comes into place. But what is the check and balance on the emergency? And there really
Exactly.
wasn't much check and balance that I could find out. I think in Missouri, if I'm remembering right, it was something like it could be some kind of simple majority in the state Congress, or the governor could just declare it. And I get it. If there's a nuclear catastrophe, you don't have time for the regular process. So then, yeah, but then there's not much check and balance to just keep dragging it on and on.
Right. Well, if you look,
So I'm
yeah.
just saying, should there be any recourse to kind of prevent something like this from happening? And
Well,
again,
there are
yeah,
individuals who lost their jobs, right, because they refused to do the vaccine, who there's a whole bunch of them winning enormous lawsuits, not just for back wages, but for pain and suffering, et cetera. So that's occurring. I haven't seen a class action involving medical professionals yet, but I'm sure there are, because there's so many doctors that lost their, I mean, the top, what do you call it? He was he was a top doctor at treating in the hospital, treating urgent care patients. He taught all of 800 published articles. He lost his ability to practice because he was doing a different protocol. He was still doing a protocol, and his worked way better than anybody else's, but he lost his hospital privileges, right? And so if you look at the Nuremberg Agreement, which was created to help everybody on the planet, right? Pretty much every, and I think but pretty much every article was violated. And so to me, that's problematic.
I mean, it was just wow. When they've just started saying, okay, you don't have to eat right anymore or exercise. All you need to do is stay inside, away from the sun, right?
Right.
You need to distance yourself from people, and then you need to put hand sanitizer on. And yeah, and am I missing anything? But that's the new healthy. As long as you do that, you'll be healthy and okay. I mean, this was an absurd. Never, if this was such a huge thing, you would think that they would be doing everything possible, going to people like you. I mean, going into the Amazon rainforest or whatever, sending space probes out, is the alarmism that was going off to find anything possible to get this under control. But no, it was just the protocol I mentioned. And then, wait for them to give you, yeah, a shot basically, and
Well,
that's where we're talking. You think they would pull out all the stops, try everything, but
yeah,
it was so far
I,
from that, from what I remember.
exactly. You know, you mentioned keeping people indoors out of the sun. And don't quote me on the numbers because it's been a long time since I saw this study. But in Israel, they had done a study having nothing to do with COVID, but they measured the vitamin D levels of people throughout the country for a study. And they found then after the pandemic or during the pandemic that the people that had the highest quartile of vitamin D. Actually, I think it was a quintile of vitamin D versus the lowest. The lowest quintile was dying at 14 times higher rate. Now, why wouldn't you give everybody, tell them? In fact, and people were getting censored off the air for telling people to do vitamin D. Simple vitamin D. Go lay in your yard, take some vitamin D tablets, right? And so, yeah, you're absolutely correct. The simplest, often, you know this in life, it's what Occam's razor, I guess, often the simplest answer is the easiest one. And people were
So
treating, patients with high dose vitamin C. In Wuhan, they flew in 50 tons of vitamin C in the first couple weeks, and they were just infusing people with vitamin C, which had very good effects.
yeah, even the name Corona is of the sun, right? It's
Yeah,
so
right.
bizarre, these
Exactly.
things, you know? So wild. Okay. Well, I think, I guess before I let you go, this has been, I know we could probably talk even more because well, I mean, the human body and health is just one of these things that's just so in depth and fascinating and covers so much of life too. To say the least, right? I wonder if I might, we did the kind of the big picture. I just wanted to ask about some very specific things, just to really briefly. This is something that's, and I don't want to just take advantage of your services here because, well, it's just not just me either. But there's a thing, it doesn't happen very often, but every once in a while, like this zapping, I call it zapping, like right before going to sleep. It will kind of get like this jolt. It almost feels like electrical, and I don't think it's too severe, but yeah, I don't know. Have you heard of this phenomena? Because
Well,
I've heard
yeah,
of a
there are
few
a
people
couple
that do
different
this too.
things that
Sure. Hmm.
I could. There's one thing where, like, if you're sitting and you start to like doze off, you'll jump, but that's not electrical. That's just right. And then the zapping. I've treated that. I don't know what causes it for sure. I don't know if it's a mini seizure. I don't know if it's some kind of electrical activity. But again, so from the Western side, I really don't know. From a Chinese side, we've been pretty successful at getting it to calm down. Yeah. And we work really on the nerves, right, with that.
It seems, yeah, it's kind of a rare thing, but it happens every once in a while, I'd say. And then the other thing is, yeah, well, the, yeah, I feel like
I
I'm
can
in
I can actually see your brain racing.
doc, doctor's office now. There's I've been told there some of these lumps under the skin. I've tried they're benign fatty tumors.
Yeah,
Do
lipomas.
you what's it called?
Lipoma.
Lipoma. So is this kind of a common thing too? Or not common, but I mean like is it something for alarm or what do you want to say about it,
From
I
a
guess?
Western side, they don't care at all. As long as unless it presses on a nerve or does something. For us, it's actually diagnostic. You'll find that those lipomas are almost always on acupuncture channels. And I had 3 of those in one arm, and they were all on the heart, pericardium, and lung channels. And when I treated those, the lipomas went away. And so you can treat right around the lipoma. It's called surrounding the dragon, and that will often work. But I found by treating the channels and getting the energy flow back to normal, that my lipomas went away. And it's in Chinese medicine, it's a phlegm deposit, is what they would call it. So you treat to lower the phlegm levels, and it's pretty effective actually. So we don't
You,
like it. One of the doctors, probably a brilliant guy. His name was Wang Juyi. He passed away a few years ago, and he wrote a book called Applied Channel Theory. And to me, it is the modern opus of Chinese medicine, acupuncture, not herbal, but acupuncture. And it's one of those books that I still haven't finished. I've had it for years. I read one page, and it's just, I'm so tripped out. I've got to go try whatever he's talking about and think about it. And I still haven't finished the book. But in it, when I studied with him, one of his major diagnostic methods was to palpate the channels. And typically, he's focused first on from the wrist to the elbow. And you can actually find on the lung channel, in women, you can find if they have cysts often in their breast or something worse. But you can find it because there'll be this gummy spot, not actually a lipoma, but it's like a gummy spot as you run your thumb over it, and it'll correspond to a particular region in the breast. And so he would do that with everybody. He would palpate the channels. Japanese acupuncturists often will palpate the channels looking for artifacts.
Yeah, this is fascinating. I probably have to go take get this looked at now then, because it's funny you mentioned phlegm too, because I remember as a more of a youngster having quite a challenge with phlegm and snot and stuff like that. Yeah, so that's very interesting. The other thing I wondered about is I would say maybe once every 2 months or something, tachycardia,
Ah,
or just
yeah,
out of the blue, the heart just starts racing. And
yeah.
I mean, yeah, yeah. So like, is there any kind of universality around that too? Or any kind of general advice for something like that? It just, it's more, it's kind of a psychological thing. It freaks me out because it's like, okay, why is my heart beating so ridiculously fast now? And then, well, of course it slows down, but it's kind of like almost, okay, this
That's
shouldn't be.
generally, I mean, grossly simple. I'll talk to people like about their hearts whether they need a plumber or an electrician, right? If they've got cholesterol buildup and it's blocking the arteries, they need a plumber. If they're getting tachycardia or arrhythmias of different kinds, then they need an electrician. So it's really looking to the electrical signal. Now, one of the really hot thing now in alternative medicine, and it's starting to get into mainstream, is really starting to really appreciate the vagus nerve. Because the vagus nerve, called vagus because it's the wanderer, that's what vagus means, and it connects to most of your organs. And so if the vagus nerve gets out of tone, out of harmony, then you can get anything from tachycardia to a stomach upset. And so I had so many people coming in over the last few months saying, "Can you treat the vagus nerve?" And I say, "Actually, I can't not treat the vagus nerve because Chinese medicine is, well, I actually could, but it'd be hard. That's what Chinese medicine has been treating for 2,500 years. They didn't know it was the vagus nerve, but they knew that they could balance the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And so the first place I would look for that is an imbalance in the vagus nerve. And one way to look for that is heart rate variability. If the heart rate variability is very, very low, often there's a little vagus nerve disharmony. And there are dozens of other ways to look at it. But that's one of the simple ones because so many people have aura rings now and different ways to track their heart rate variability.
Nice, thank you for that. Yeah, the polyvagal theory. I had
Yes.
co-host for a while was she was really into the polyvagal theory and things like this. So, well, I think the only other thing I have before we start wrapping this up is I was just wondering about just different energy systems. Do you think that and I don't know why this is important, maybe with my fiance's work, which I won't go into now, but I was just wondering if different people from different areas of the world do their energy systems, or I would just, well, I probably shouldn't say that because it's kind of a vague term, but I mean, the meridian system, does it operate pretty much the same universally, or are there variations, I don't know, within generations, within ethnicities? Within whatever demographic or different subdivisions we want to give it. And
The basics of the system are the same. And like the Chinese didn't make this, people think, well, the Chinese made this up, to explain something. They didn't make it up. They were meditators. They felt their bodies, and you can feel the meridians. The uh, Mayans called them the wind in the channels. They knew it. The Incas called them the rivers of light. That's my favorite, the rivers of light. Ayurvedic medicine, they've known for 5,000 years at least. Who knows how much before that, but there's, historical records of 5,000 years. So in general, we all have the same system. Now, through a variety of good and bad things that we can do or be exposed to, those get either we have a device called an acufinder, not an acufinder, an acugraph, and you check the 12 certain points on the body, and you can see the electrical current. that's going through them because it's measuring resistance to electrical flow. And one of the things about the meridians is they're the areas of the least resistance to electromagnetic flow. Not coincidentally, they all lie over the points lie over major nerve bifurcations. So you're stimulating so many different things. But we'll see people that are split, we'll call it. And so the pericardium on meridian on one side might be too strong, and on the other side, it's too weak. Now, that's kind of cool information to use for acupuncture, right? You can tonify one side and sedate the other. And so there is a huge difference. Just like, well, male sperm counts are down 50% over the last 40 years. Some variation of those numbers. And my generation has far lower testosterone than my dad's generation, and his generation had lower testosterone than his dad's. And it just keeps going down and down and down. And there are lots of theories about that, and certainly endocrine disruptors have a place. But yeah, so it's going to be different, right? The different energy levels through those meridians is going to be different. But the system's the same.
Got it. Well, Dr. John, this has been so fascinating. For me, and I'm sure plenty of other people listening to this, would you like to tell people how they can get in touch with you? What kind of, if you have any projects or anything else you would like to promote or bring to people's attention?
I'm working on a book right now called Never, Ever, Ever Give Up. In 2 Decembers ago, I guess that was 2023, I almost died. I had a heart procedure because I had developed atrial flutter, and I can fix AFib, but I can't fix atrial flutter. That someone maybe can, but I can't, because then what's happening is the cells that should not be sending out electrical signals are. So I had a procedure, magic procedures, but then the next day I developed pneumonia and congestive heart failure. Get into the hospital. There they saved my life again with high-dose IV antibiotics. But then once that was corrected, they just sent me home. No diet advice, no exercise advice, no nothing. So I ran all my labs and found out where the problems were. Like I had a very high C-reactive protein and several other problems. So then I treated myself. And so this was my road to recovery as I'm lying in the hospital bed going, my purpose for being on the planet has not been accomplished yet. I'm not done, and I'm going to turn this around because I, had not been paying attention to my health. I'd been focusing on everybody else, and I made a commitment to turn my life around in 4 months. So I got to the gym 5 days a week. I increased my strength. I doubled it in 4 months. Right. And then everything else went into line. My testosterone levels started coming up. So I had enough energy to write a book. And so that's the book that I'm working on now. We're just publishing a book 2 in our lab reading series called The Sweet Spot. And then we have one that's out from last year. So I'm spending a lot of time trying to get this information out to the world. And so in the book I'm writing now, I go into great detail about supplements, diets, meditation that I did. I'm not saying it's what everybody else should do, but I'm just saying this is what I did and it worked for me. So that's kind of what I'm working on now. And I have a lot of shows that I've done, webinars. I did radio for years, and those can be found by going to thebalancingpoint.net. Thebalancingpoint.net.
Well, very cool, Dr. John. Thanks again for joining me. And may all beings everywhere out there come to know their most helpful, optimal health for their own benefit and for the benefit of all beings everywhere. May all beings everywhere realize awakening and be free. Bye.
Thank you, John.